A Wild Rose by Wendell Berry. Sometimes hidden from me in daily custom and in trust, so that I live by you unaware as by the beating of my heart. Suddenly you flare in my sight, a wild rose looming at the edge of thicket, grace and light where yesterday was only shade. And once again I am blessed, choosing again what I chose before. From the first book of Ruth. During the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. A man with his wife and 2 sons went from Bethlehem of Judah to dwell in the territory of Moab. The name of that man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephraites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the territory of Moab and settled there. But Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. Then only she was left, along with her 2 sons. They took wives for themselves, Moabite women. The name of the first was Orpah, and the name of the second was Ruth. And they lived there for about 10 years. But both of the sons, Mahlon and Chilion, also died. Only the woman was left, without her 2 children and without her husband. Then she arose along with her daughters-in-law to return from the field at Moab, because while in the territory of Moab, she had heard that the Lord had paid attention to his people by providing food for them. She left the place where she had been, and her 2 daughters-in-law went with her. They went along the road to return to the land of Judah. Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, turn back, each of you to the household of your mother. May the Lord deal faithfully with you, just as you have done with the dead and with me. May the Lord provide for you so that you may find security, each woman in the household of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. But they replied to her, "No, instead we will return with you to your people." Naomi replied, "Turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Will there again be sons in my womb, that they would be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters. Go. I am too old for a husband. If I were to say that I have hope, even if I had a husband tonight, and even more if I were to bear sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you refrain from having a husband? No, my daughters, this is more bitter for me than for you, since the Lord's will has come out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth stayed with her. Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law is returning to her people and to her gods. Turn back after your sister-in-law." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to abandon you, to turn back from following after you. Wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do this to me, and more so, even if death separates me from you." Here are Spirit-filled words that invited us to wonder. Spirit, reveal in them, and through words spoken here. Amen.
So, I just wanted to provide my thoughts on the passage, and that is the Bible really brings points home. You're in a bad part of town with a famine, no food, and in a patriarchal society, it's 3 women. This seems like kind of the worst of the worst scenario for the lot. I admire the courage, though. I love that line. Wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you stay, I will stay. How many times do I know the right course of action in life? I'm not sure. But I do know I know it more often than I take it. This passage reminds me that I need to pray for the strength to make the moral decision as opposed to the easy decision.
Thank you, Jeff. So yesterday was actually the completion of my 8th year here at Epiphany as one of your pastors, which is the longest I've actually ever served a congregation in my 21 years of career as a minister. That may seem odd to you, especially if you're a person who stayed at a job or a place, a neighborhood for a very long time. You know, I kind of have explanations for all those transitions, those moments of moving on to what was next, but I've often wondered if it wasn't just part of a pattern that began early in my life, and especially my teens, when my family would move back, they moved back to the States after many years of living in Singapore and Indonesia, and we and they spent years afterwards trying to find their sort of footing after spending their 20s and 30s living all over the world. In fact, I have now lived longer in Chicago than anywhere else in the United States by at least 2 years. I spent 10 years in Indonesia as a kid, but Chicago has become my new hometown, though my family home, of course, is in Meridian, Mississippi. It is, as we say in the South, where my people are from, though that sadly has changed now that so many of them have died. Now, I still count Meridian as my hometown because that is where we as a family went to visit in my childhood, and then my parents eventually settled back there in the 1990s. But it's an odd thing to have a hometown that you really have only visited, right, and never actually lived in throughout your life. I think a lot of children whose parents perhaps served in the military have experienced that kind of rootlessness, of not quite being from a place, the experience of moving from one place to another to navigate new worlds, new schools, new places. And of course, that has its gifts. I mean, it makes you nimble in many ways. But of course, it has its shadows as well. When I learn that someone has lived all their place, one town, or even in a few of your cases here, in one neighborhood, and you find that often here in Chicago, I am amazed. I envy them to have that kind of experience of being rooted in a place. It's a real envy on my part. But people move, as they have always moved, into new places, new neighborhoods. I'm in the midst of reading Tony Judd's book. It's a really good book. Tony Judd's book called Post-War, A History of Europe since 1945. And I found myself startled by the amount of immigration or migration, forced and voluntary, that happened in the post-war years. The patterns of migration, the shifting borders that were already a reality before World War II, but after the war, people who had been moved by the Nazis and the Russians sought to go home, or sometimes they tried to stay in their new homelands, hoping not to go back to places like the USSR, where life was still incredibly difficult. Borders changed, and one moment you were a Pole, and now, just magically, you were a citizen of the USSR. One moment you were forced to work in Germany as slave labor, and then you were told to leave after the war, but where they wanted to send you back was far worse than the place that you were now living in. Literally millions moved from here to there after the war, even up until the early 1950s. I remember the story of our own church member, Fritz Forster, who died some years ago, about his time trying to get back home after the war from a Russian prisoner of war camp after the war, catching trains and walking, and after a stint of being forced to fight for the Nazis when they took over his home country. It took him a month or so, and he did this with thousands and thousands of other soldiers trying to get back home, all wondering what they would now find in those new hometowns or old hometowns. Now, thankfully, most of us have not been forced physically to move, but others in countries have. In fact, our own Tedros, who had to move from Eritrea to Ethiopia and then to the United States after being persecuted for simply being a journalist that would not write the kind of stories the government wanted. There are millions right now that have immigrated into this country looking for safety, for a better life for themselves, or for their families back home whom they support with their low wages in this country. Like most countries, America is not, of course, immune to waves of xenophobia in our history, and we are, I think, sadly going through that kind of that wave and experience right now. And of course, that human movement, that need to move on to something better, or at least in the hopes of something better, is at the core of our text today. The book of Ruth tells the story of her namesake, surely, but there are really two heroines in this story, Ruth and Naomi. Naomi is an Israelite who married a foreigner, someone from Moab, which was one of Israel's sworn enemies, a country known for idolatry and apostasy and sexual promiscuity. Naomi has moved to Moab because there was a famine in her own hometown or homeland of Israel. And while in this new country, she marries a Moab man. There are 2 male children that come out of this forbidden union, in a way, forbidden from the Jewish side of the equation, because they were forbidden oftentimes to marry outside of the Jewish faith. And then, of course, her sons marry as well. They have 2 sons, and they marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. But, of course, something goes tragically sideways as Naomi loses her husband, and then her 2 boys die. And keep in mind, this is her Social Security. Men are the people that are going to take care of her in her old age. And this is a disaster of the first order, leaving her and Ruth and Naomi, Orpah, with no husbands. Again, a disaster in a patriarchal culture such as this. Women were denied or defined by their relationship to men, first as daughters in their father's household, and then as wives within their husband's household. You can see how much the patriarchy infuses a text when Naomi decries the fact that she can no longer bear any more children because of her age. What use is she? She cannot provide for these daughters. She cannot magically make husbands for them, right? In this male-dominated culture. And then when she tells Orpah and Ruth to go back, she encourages them to find new husbands, new households to enter into so that they could have a chance, at least a financial chance, since women were expected to work only in certain kinds of household duties. Think of how many times in the Bible the people were told to take care of the widows and the orphans. They were 2 categories of people that were financially abandoned because they had no value any longer without being connected to men, either as daughters or wives. Naomi, Ruth, Orpah, they seem to be people that are going through, I would say, a really rough patch. I always think of this when I see people going through years and years of what seems like the worst kind of luck and the worst kind of life. That wonderful William Blake poem that goes, "Every night and every morn, some to misery are born. Every morn and every night, some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to endless night." And then the night continues in Naomi's life until she hears word that her own homeland, Israel, has been blessed finally with food. An irony not lost on her, surely, as she had left that homeland because it had been earlier cursed with no food. So she decides to go back home, and her 2 Moabite daughter-in-laws decide to go with her. And for reasons we don't quite know, in the midst of the journey itself, as they were going on the way, she dissuades them. She turns around and says, "Don't go any further with me." Maybe she fears that they won't be welcome in Israel and certainly won't be able to find husbands to start over with. Or again, as Moabite women, they will have better luck in Moab than they will in this new foreign land that discouraged intermarriage between Jews and others. Actually, this whole book of Ruth is, in a way, an indictment of that very idea around intermarriage, something that we need to look a bit at here. Remember, if I'm going to remember, jog some memory for you. Remember that when the best and the brightest of Israel returned from their captivity in Babylon to Jerusalem, the prophets Ezra and Nehemiah were shocked to find that those Israelites that had been left behind had intermarried with non-Jews, often with people who were considered enemies of Israel. In a horrific form of ethnic cleansing, these 2 prophets demand that all Israelite men should leave their foreign wives and children, leaving behind women and children who are now abandoned to poverty and starvation. It is not one of the better moments in the story of Israel or in the Bible. And I certainly believe that God had nothing to do with this kind of cruelty, despite the prophet's claim that God had told them to make this demand of the people. What's so interesting is that scholars believe, or some scholars believe, that the book of Ruth was written at about the same time as the story of the ethnic cleansings of Jerusalem, in a way, and written around the same times as the book of Ezra and Nehemiah was written. And it almost seems, if you look at the book, it almost seems like an intentional counter-narrative, as if it was written to counter this uglier story that Nehemiah and Ezra had written. Whoever wrote the story didn't think that God was so hard and fast with the insider-outsider story that Ezra and Nehemiah had earlier sold to the people. The xenophobia of that story gets confronted in our own story today of Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, foreigners who are faithful, good people, who are willing to leave everything and start over in a new life and a new land. The story of Ruth is set in hundreds of years earlier than it was written, but it was likely written hundreds of years afterwards. And the author seems to want to show us that God uses everyone of every ethnic group to make God's will happen. And again, as Pastor Megan mentioned, Ruth, a Moabite woman from the wrong tribe, from the wrong side of the street, are then connected to King David, the greatest of Israel's kin. And then Jesus himself will trace their lineage to this Moabite woman named Ruth, a clue surely that these borders we have put between each other mean nothing to the living God. God does not use our maps. God does not use our maps to shut out other people. And then, of course, perhaps we should not as well. But back to the story. Naomi has discouraged her sister-in-law from moving with her back home to Israel, thinking, of course, they have a better chance in their homeland. And both of these incredible women resist Naomi's plea to leave her. But one eventually will make the choice to continue on with her towards Israel. This Ruth, this Moabite woman with seemingly no clear future in a hostile foreign land. What was it that compelled her to follow Naomi? Why wouldn't she take the sound advice that life might be better in Moab than for her in Israel? Well, according to the text, it seems that it's because of a personal loyalty born out of love for her mother-in-law, this woman connected to her not by blood, but by choice. It's so interesting that the famous words spoken here that we all heard, when those last words we heard in our text, are actually spoken from one woman to another woman. Ruth to Naomi, and they are often used in weddings. Wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do this to me, and more so, if even death separates me from you. Even the pledge to be with her until the end, of course, is what gave rise to that famous wedding tradition, those words that say, until death do us part. I don't mean to imply anything beyond loyalty and love between these two women. We don't have the evidence for that, and the story does not lend it necessarily that way. But it does show us the powerful bond that people can have with each other, even if they are not so connected by blood and only by choice. My mother used to always say, but they're blood. And I'm thinking, I haven't seen them in 10 years. I have no idea who these people are. I am closer to my best friend than those wonderful people that I may be connected to by blood. And it was always such an interesting thing. And it's odd because she knew that experience as well, but we just say it glibly, right? Naomi thinks that she has lost everything with the death of her husbands and her two sons, but she really hasn't. I mean, the women in her life are just as valuable as the men. Their loyalty and love is just as precious, though they are not valued in this particular patriarchal cultural setting. You know, I think most moments of moving on, moments when we had to move on to the next place, a new town, a new house, a new country, a new life, they are fueled by a love that gives us courage. Whenever I see men and women of Hispanic origins or any kind of origin working in this country, I often think of what drove them to make that hazardous journey, sometimes not legally, into this country. Often these men and women arrive in this country with no family around them, though there are connections perhaps to others from the villages they've left behind. Long hours, hard work, often low wages beyond what is mandated, with wage theft being a reality in their lives, literally owners saying, we're not paying you, and we don't have to pay you, because who are you going to complain to? What legal authority are you going to complain to, right? And then sending a lot of that hard-earned money back to families that are counting on them to survive. They do it out of love for those left behind. They move to a foreign land out of love for their families, love for the possibility of a better life for their children. Ruth is willing to abandon her country out of love for Naomi, and is willing to brave the possibility that this new country will be hostile to her very presence. The rest of Ruth's story has a happy but complicated ending, and it shows what she is willing to do in order to help both of them survive. She is willing to move on for the sake of another, out of love for another, in hope that another country will be better than the one she left behind. As a young clergy person, Many years ago, I once left a very large congregation that I served during a difficult time in their life together. There was a lot of conflict in our life together, and my eventual resignation from that position was, I think, prompted by an ethical lapse by the leadership of that community. But that decision to resign was something I had been thinking about in my head for a while, because I was a member of a set of clergy, 8 clergy on that staff, that had been decimated in the end. I was the last one standing by recent resignations and firings. I kept thinking that it might be best, in the best interest of the congregation, for me to leave so that the church could go forward into something new. I think my instincts were true in that case. I think, I have to think that I made the right decision, at least partially for them. But I have to tell you that I also resigned out of love for me, for my sanity, for my health, emotionally and physically, because the stress of negotiating this church conflict, one not of my own making, was too much for me after a while. Sometimes we move on not just for the sake of another, but also for our own sake, for our health, for our future. Anyone who has ever had to leave a relationship, a marriage, a friendship, a toxic work environment, knows that leaving and moving on is often the best move possible. So for those of you who've been watching Facebook, here it comes. You have all heard the famous Dolly Parton song, "I Will Always Love You," right? We all have. Made doubly famous by Whitney Houston, her cover of it sometime in the mid-90s. But the backstory is really interesting. Dolly Parton had been on the Cole Porter television show for years, but she was itching to move on from the show towards a more solo career. But her loyalty and her love for her friend, Cole Porter, was strong, and he frankly would not let her out of her contract because, frankly, at that time, she was one of the best things about that show. In her frustration one night, after lots of difficult conversations with Cole, she goes home and she wrote, "I Will Always Love You," in one night. And she came into Cole Porter's office the next day to sing it to him. That song was her attempt to say how much she loved him as a friend and as someone who had given her an important career break, but it was time for her to go on for her sake and for his sake. And if you listen to the words in light of that, we often think it's about a romantic song. But in many ways, this is a song about saying, it's best that we part. It's best that I'm doing this for you as well as for me, right? And as someone who had given her this incredible career break, but it was time for her to go on. Sometimes an act of taking care of oneself is an act of love for another human being who may be unaware of how often we get in the way of each other, in the way of us going towards something new, some new country to begin our journey towards. And after Dolly Parton sang that song to Cole in his office, he told her through his tears that he understood, and he eventually released her from her contract. Now, it took courage for Dolly Parton to strike out on her home, leaving Cole Porter and a hugely successful TV program behind. But it was done out of love, right? Love for him and even herself. I think of the endless night that Naomi must have been experiencing in Moab, the shattering of her life into so many pieces, left with nothing but 2 women that loved her relentlessly. It was, as Blake said, an endless night. But when we're in those places, those moments when we don't think the dawn will ever come, there is God. And if there is God, there is hope. Wendell Berry, in our modern lesson today, says that so much of God is hidden from him as he lives his life. He is a man of faith. And then there is this wild rose looming at the edge of the thicket, where yesterday there was only shade. He is blessed, he writes. And he is then able, with that reminder, to choose what he had chose before, which is life and hope and a new thing, and maybe goodness itself. Courage is almost always rooted in something, right? And I think if we were really to think about it, most of the time courage is rooted in love of some sort or another. Naomi, Ruth, love compelled them to forward into some new thing. We can get to the far country, some new thing, if love is our lodestar, if we root ourselves in love, which is God, of course, according to 1 John. I am blessed, Naomi must have been thinking, like Barry says here, as she saw love in Ruth's eyes, something she had not seen fully since the death of her husbands and sons. If I am loved, I can do this. I can move to a foreign land, to some new place, a new space, some new thing. So, my friends, look for the wild rose in the thicket, the God who is love. Look for God in the eyes of another, and then get going. Get going on to that new story, that new land, that new life. Amen. Friends, join me in prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for being the God of us and being the God of all. We thank you for meeting us in this land, wherever we may find ourselves, emotionally, spiritually, literally. And thank you for meeting us not in this land, in some new place, some old place, some place we may need to go to. Give us a courage rooted in love of you and rooted in others, so that if we need to go to some new land, we will have the courage and the will to do so. Surely you will meet us there. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.